Welcome back, everyone. I'm especially excited to have you join us as we get into the Oracle Decodes, the Eye of Horus, the Eye of Ra, the Birth of Horus, and the Contendings of Horus and Set, Ancient Egypt Part 2. We have a lot to cover in this piece. I'm excited to jump right into it, which we're going to do and pick up right where we left off in Part 1 of our Decoding of Ancient Egypt. So if you haven't seen Part 1, go back, watch that quickly, and then come on back here because we're just going to jump right in here. Going again to start out at Wikipedia for just the basic mainstream information you can find easily about the ancient Egyptian god Horus. Usually depicted, as we saw in the first piece, as a falcon-headed god. And you may remember from our first part of Decoding Ancient Egypt that Horus is the son of the ancient god Osiris and his queen, the goddess Isis. And we took a look at that decoding of Osiris's death and resurrection in our first Ancient Egypt decoding part. Wikipedia will tell us a few things that are important for decoding what we're going to get into in a few minutes in this piece. So Horus is one of the most significant deities most known for the god of kingship and the sky. Horus was worshipped in ancient Egypt from the late prehistoric Egypt all the way through the Ptolemaic kingdom and Roman Egypt. Egyptologists note the various different forms Horus appears in and says that these various forms may be possibly different manifestations of the same multi-layered deity in which certain attributes or syncretic relationships are emphasized. And as we'll see as we get to our decoding, that is most definitely true. Horus is the first known national god, specifically related to the ruling pharaoh who in time came to be regarded as a manifestation of Horus in life and Osiris in death. And as we took a look at our first Ancient Egypt video, the most common relationship of family that this trinity is being described as has Horus as the son of Osiris and Isis, and he plays the role of Osiris's heir. He's also, Horus, the rival to Set. So in another tradition, it's Hathor, who, by the way, is also represented visually wearing a crown with bull-shaped horns on her head, as well as Isis. So we know that this encodes for the constellation of Taurus in the sky story, as we looked at in our first part. So it's in this tradition, they call her Hathor, that is either Horus's wife or mother. Now remember that the Horus story goes back around 4,000 or more years ago to the pyramid texts, and we looked at that in our first video piece. These texts describe the nature of the pharaoh in different characters as both Horus and Osiris, the pharaoh being Horus in life and Osiris in death, where he was then unified or united with the other gods. New incarnations of Horus succeeded the deceased pharaoh on earth in the form of each new pharaoh. So this is all about divine lineage and kingship. In the first Ancient Egypt video, we talked about Ra or Atum, where Osiris and his son Horus received their lineage of kingship from, justified by their lineage to the creator of the world, Ra or Atum. Therefore, this kingship lineage or manifestation of Horus on earth with each pharaoh, you can see then was the justification of both his divinity and right to rule for the pharaoh. And as you can see when comparing the way that the sun god Ra, the falcon-headed god, is visually the same representation we see in Horus as we saw in our first piece, this shows obvious visual evidence of both the syncretism of these myths over time and what is also meant to intentionally show resemblance between them. The idea of sharing not only the same divine lineage, it's even in how it's translated into how these gods are visually represented. A family resemblance, you might say, in other words. In our first Ancient Egypt piece, we decoded the murder of Osiris by his brother Set and the resurrection of Osiris by his queen Isis and the magical conception of their son Horus. And that's where we left off in the first piece in that story. What we'll be decoding in this next part of the story is after Isis is now pregnant with Horus, she is said to have hidden in the Nile Delta marshlands from her brother Set, knowing that he would kill her and Osiris' son Horus if she was found. It was there that she bore her divine son Horus. Since Horus was said to be the sky, he was considered to also contain the sun and the moon, and it became known that his right eye was the sun and his left eye the moon. It's after the contendings with Set that he became known as Horus the Great or Horus the Elder. So I'm pointing this out because then there's a difference or a distinction made between Horus the Younger, or baby Horus, and the God-man Horus later became. And you can see that just one example here is of a statue found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of Isis and the baby Horus that was an idol of worship you can think of. Horus was also known as the son of truth and Horus of the two horizons. Horus is also thought to be the inspiration for the Sphinx at Giza. And the other thing we're going to take from Wikipedia here about Horus is that Macrobius is said to have documented that celebrations held annually in honor of Horus occurred during the time of year known as the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. So now the story becomes about what is called the Contendings of Horus and Set, which were supposedly many battles that went on for many years in which Horus, now a man, was battling Set, who murdered Horus's father, who was the rightful ruler of Egypt. So once again, you can see how this part of the myth continues the narrative of kingship by divine lineage and succession, as this part of the story focuses on the story of how Horus eventually triumphs over Set in the end, taking back from Set the kingship that he usurped when he murdered Horus's father Osiris. Now remember, in many previous videos, we've talked about what many of these stories and myths go back to a time before we as people had writing, which means that some of these stories have strange or very intense, even violent events told within them, and it's translating or trying to represent the stories that are being told above all of our heads in the sky. But it's also so that these strange or intense elements have a stickier place in our memory. They're mnemonic tricks. Because remember, the memory is the only technology we would have to record these stories on in a time before writing. I wanted to give that reminder before we go on to what's going to sound like a very strange part of the story that's found next. So Wikipedia tells us, according to the Contendings of Horus and Set, that after many battles, Set is depicted as trying to prove his dominance by seducing Horus to have sex with him, so he can inseminate Horus, which is what proves Set's dominance. Horus seems to at first agree, but during the act, Horus places his hands between his thighs to catch Set's semen, and then throws it into the river. With the help of his mother Isis, she then spreads her son Horus's semen on Set's favorite food, lettuce, and they trick Set to eat it. They then all go to the gods to once and for all settle the dispute over the kingship or rulership of Egypt. The gods first listen to Set's claim of domination over Horus, and then they call forth Set's semen. But because it answers from the river, Set's claim of dominance over Horus is invalidated. However, the gods then call forth Horus's semen and find it answering from inside Set. The dominant one then found to be Horus, who was given the rightful kingship. It was Horus who then ruled over Egypt as a worshipped deity all the way until the fall of the ancient Egyptian civilization when Rome took over. All right, now there's just a few more bits of info that we want to look at here about what is known as the Eye of Ra, the Eye of Horus, and sometimes it's just collectively known as the Eye of Wadjat. So we're looking at Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum's website here, where they tell us that the Wadjat eye is one of the most common icons associated with ancient Egypt. The left eyes are said to be associated with the moon and the falcon-headed god Horus. The right eye said to be associated with the sun and with also a falcon-headed god, but this time Ra, who we've already decoded partly in the last video. The left eye of Horus is said to be the eye of completion because, like the moon, it waxes and wanes, and being that it's the eye of completion, it's healing and regenerative, and when worn as an amulet was for health and safety, and also as an aid to safely pass into the afterlife, which is why this amulet was found so often with many mummies. In one telling of the myth between the battle of Horus and Set, it is said that Set loses a testicle and Horus loses one eye. Horus presents his wounded eye to the deity Thoth, the god of knowledge or god of wisdom, who repairs it, and in some tellings, Horus gives his repaired eye to his father Osiris to help him pass safely himself to the afterlife. Others link this with the insemination of Set by Horus by trickery, and when the gods call forth Horus's semen, it emerges as a glowing star-like object from Set's forehead, and this is how the deity Thoth was divinely created or born in some tellings of the myth. We'll get to the deity Thoth specifically in our next video about ancient Egypt. The website at Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum goes on to say, the right eye, the solar eye of Ra, was thought to be embodied by a protective feline goddess. And this feline goddess is sometimes known as Sekhmet, who we're also going to take a look at in our next decoding. But her ferocity was said to be protective and warded off evil to the wearer of this right eye amulet. All right, now we're ready to take all of this info, and it is quite a bit, but we're going to get to easily decoding it in a way that I've not ever seen done before by any other scholar or researcher. It's pretty exciting. So we're looking at a screenshot from where we left off in the myth of Osiris in part 1, and we're looking up once again in the sky at that very special place we're calling the real oracle or the real all-seeing eye, from the perspective of someone in a location 11 miles away from the pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx. And the city, strangely enough, is named after a date, as we found. It's called the 6th of October, Egypt. We're also 10 days past the summer solstice. That's where we left off in our first piece in the northern hemisphere. This is a time of year we learned where the sun rises in the constellation of Gemini, which we decoded in part 1 is the deity Set. The brother he murdered and took the kingship from is Osiris, who we decoded from part 1 is the constellation of Ophiuchus. And you can see in this screenshot, it's Ophiuchus or Osiris that is almost fully descended into the west in this screenshot, and it's Osiris's queen Isis that we decoded as the constellation of Taurus in the first piece, who after using her magic to resurrect her dead husband Osiris and making for him a golden phallus, they magically conceive their son Horus. And remember, the creator of the world, Ra, or Atum, is originally where Osiris's lineage that is now passing to his son Horus comes from, the divine right to rule. Now both he, Horus, and the sun god Ra are most often, we also saw in the first piece, depicted as falcon-headed gods. But now for the first time, we can fully decode who both the falcon-headed god Ra and Horus really are. In this screenshot, you will find Ra syncretized over time into Horus, the falcon-headed god, right at the location of the Egyptians' Ankh, right at the location of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic in this screenshot. It's the constellations known nowadays as Pisces and Cetus the whale. But to the ancient Egyptians, 4,000 and more years ago, you can see that these combined constellations looked to them like a giant falcon in the sky. The head of Cetus, the whale, looking more to them like a falcon with his beak, and the two fishes of Pisces looking more to them like his giant falcon wings. So amazing to see this more than 4,000-year-old story come to life in a new way that, as of yet, almost no one has seen before, even though it's been right there the whole time above our heads. So we're looking here at what's happening 10 days past the summer solstice, at the part of the story where Set has already usurped Osiris's kingship after murdering him. Isis has resurrected Osiris, and they together magically conceive their son Horus. So before going on now to decoding the story of Horus's birth, let's take a look at what we already know quickly and decode the Eye of Ra and the Eye of Horus, or collectively known as the Eyes of Wadjet. We have a screenshot here that we've queued up just 2 months earlier from where we were already looking, backed up to what we commonly call the date of May 1st of 2020 this year, when the sun is going to rise, as you can see, with the falcon-headed god Horus. And we're now ready to see where one of the most well-known symbols from ancient Egypt actually comes from, what are called the Wadjet eyes, or the Eye of Ra and the Eye of Horus. On the day at sunrise, when most scholars agree the ancient Egyptian calendar day begins, the first eye to see the sun then is this one. The eyebrow encodes for what we call today the constellation of Aries. The eye part with the long tail encodes for the head of Cetus, in combination with the constellation as it's known today, the first fish of what is known as Pisces. The bottom part of the eye encodes for the slightly crooked neck, you can see, of what is known today as the constellation of Cetus, that is just now risen exactly that much above the eastern horizon at sunrise this time of year. And that leaves the swirled tail at the bottom of the eye, corresponding to the second fish in what is known today as the constellation of Pisces. Truly amazing what we can see with the help of the real all-seeing eye, isn't it? And this is one of the reasons also why Horus was known as Horus of the Two Horizons, and we'll see where he ends up at the end of this piece to complete that. Let's now get into decoding this next part of the story, where Osiris and his queen Isis have already magically conceived their child. Now Isis is pregnant, having fled to the marshlands in the Nile Delta to hide from Set. We're looking at the screenshot of the time of year known as the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. So from where we were just looking at the beginning of May to the winter solstice now, it's almost 9 months later, the length of a normal woman's pregnancy here on Earth. And we're looking at the opposite time of year that we were looking at during the first part of this myth. We were looking at the summer solstice time of year. We're now to the winter solstice, corresponding with the account given by Macrobius, as we read earlier, that celebrations honoring the god Horus occurred around the winter solstice. Now again, staying in the location of the 6th of October, Egypt, we are taking a look at the winter solstice at sunset, this year occurring on the date commonly called December 21st of 2020. You can see Isis, as Taurus, fully risen over the eastern horizon at sunset, in the east, where things begin, and at sunset, when the night will begin. Isis, who successfully stays hidden in the Nile Delta marshlands away from Set, because as you can see, the constellation of Gemini, or Set, has not yet risen in the east after Taurus, so Isis or Taurus indeed stays hidden and out of the sight of Set, where he can't find her, long enough for Isis to give birth to her divine son Horus, who is found with one of his wings just over the location in this screenshot of the cross of the north-south meridian line in the Arc of the Ecliptic, or the ancient Egyptian Ankh. It's the first hour after the sun sets, the beginning or the dawn of the night. You'll find the newborn god, the falcon-headed god Horus, center stage, high in the real all-seeing eye, larger than life, and he's the first to be seen the moment the lights go down on the sky stage, where 4,000 or more years ago maybe, a new star was born on the world stage to be worshipped. The baby Horus in this story we're decoding here. What we're going to get into next beyond this, though, is taking this decoding to another level completely on the wow scale, in my opinion. Take a look at our old friend Orion we've seen in so many of our decoding videos, and this is going to be a big reason he keeps showing up, as you'll see. Before we go forward, take note that the constellation of Orion on the winter solstice, at the dawn of night, it's every star of the constellation of Orion that's above the eastern horizon except for one. So when we go forward to just a few days later, to a date that will be very familiar to many, as the date we commonly call December 25th, 2020, or the date practicing Christians celebrate as Christmas, you can see that it's now that the entire constellation of Orion has fully risen above the eastern horizon when the night begins. All it takes is to shift your perspective, and you can start to see how all the elements of a birth story were right there. But before now, no one knew what they were really looking at. Couldn't the constellation of Taurus, the way that it's shaped, easily fit a story about how a woman is positioned when she's giving birth? Or the way that the constellation of Pisces is shaped in its location? Couldn't this be the very womb of Isis from which the baby Horus was born? The baby, perhaps, in a cradle or a basket, the head in the constellation of what we call nowadays Cetus, and the umbilical cord, the constellation we nowadays call Eridanus, tying the baby Horus to the man he will grow into and become, the constellation we know these days as Orion. This is the reason that the baby Horus and Horus the Elder were made distinct in both the myth and the religion of ancient Egypt and many other stories, as we will see going forward, and probably that you can already guess, as this is sounding all too familiar. As we move forward a week later to what we commonly call December 31st of 2020, when many celebrate New Year's Eve right in the middle of the night, it's when the star Sirius is found to be right in the middle of the north-south meridian line, marking the start of the new year, and that's, of course, what we decoded in a previous piece, was the ball dropping tradition in New York City on New Year's Eve, because Sirius does the same thing here. If you follow up above where Sirius is sitting on the north-south meridian line, you can see that at the top of the cross of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic, or the Egyptian Ankh, it's the constellation of Gemini, or the deity Set in this story. And now you're starting to see why such battles went on for so long between Horus and Set. There were disputes about when to start the calendar and who would be the god of it. Before we move on, you can also see why he was called the Horus of Two Horizons now, noting how specifically the Aries-Pisces-Cetus combination, the ancient Egyptians called the falcon-headed god Horus and the Eye of Horus, the Eye of Ra, or Wedget eyes. Remember, we were looking at it first in the beginning of May, and it's 8.5 to 9 months almost later. The sun was rising in the constellation the Egyptians called Horus over the eastern horizon then, and here at the beginning of what we celebrate today as New Year's, one of Horus's wings, the second fish of the constellation of Pisces, is going to be descending flatly into the horizon in the west. That is your Horus of Two Horizons. Now finally, let's decode what's really going on in the battles that went on for many years in the myth between Horus, the son of Osiris, the king murdered by his brother Set, and then remember Set usurped Osiris's kingship after he murdered him. Horus, now having become a man, is doing battle with his murderous uncle Set to sit on the throne as rightful ruler of the world. And so that brings us back to a screenshot again of the summer solstice, taking a look at what's going on in the sky story as the sun is making its way toward the western horizon, where it's going to set. We've shifted our perspective slightly, where we're facing here a more westward than our usual due south-facing view. And this is because, as we've seen before, even stellarium has some tricks to keep some of this sky story occulted from our view. So as the sun is going down, notice its position. It's a place we've seen many times before in previous pieces. We also have seen that on the summer solstice, not only is the sun found to be held in Orion's hand, that dark spot there with the sun is also the new moon. And that new moon is also in Orion's hand at the same time. But notice also at the same time that it could be said that both the sun and the moon are found to be at the feet of Gemini. Or in this story, the sun and the moon could said to be at the feet of Set. Also note the positions of Gemini and Orion, or Set and Horus the Elder, in relation to one another. Orion, or Horus, will be going down into the western horizon first, with Gemini, or Set, on top. One more shift of perspective is required to see something we've looked at before in our decoding. It's the planet Mercury that's also found to be in the constellation of Gemini during the summer solstice in this time of the year, which is the real reason that scholars, you're going to find, in the past have connected the deity Set with specifically the planet Mercury, because it's Mercury that's in Gemini during the summer solstice as well. And in this story of the contendings of Horus and Set, Mercury then is going to represent the testicle Set will lose in the battle, as you'll see, and the new moon, associated specifically with the eye of Horus. That moon will represent the one eye that Horus loses in the battle, as you'll also see. So let's see what happens the following day, the day after the summer solstice, on a date commonly called June 22nd of 2020, while the sun is about to set in the west. We've got the constellation of Orion, or Horus the Elder, or Horus the Great, going down in the west, with what appears to be the constellation of Gemini, or Set, seducing and dominating Horus on top of him. How the ancient Egyptians interpret it as a sexual act here. Horus, with the help of his mother Isis, as you can see the constellation of Taurus there descending in the western horizon, appropriately hidden by stellarium here for this story, she's behind a tree. And just take a look as Orion, the constellation, is descending. It's going to be his phallus area himself that's going to appear to touch the earth first, right? So this corresponds to Isis spreading Horus's semen on lettuce that grows on the earth, right? And they both trick Set into eating it. Notice that the new moon that just the day before was found to be with the sun in Orion's, or Horus's, hand has now moved, and the new moon is found the next day to be within the constellation of Gemini, or with Set. This move of the new moon, told within the myth, is both Set's gouging out of one of Horus's eyes and the way that Set ended up being inseminated or dominated by Horus in the end of this story through trickery. Going forward one more day, so now 2 days past the summer solstice, you can see that now the moon and the planet Mercury are both moved out of the constellation of Gemini, or Set, as well. This is the testicle that Set loses in the battle, and the moon is now on its way back to waxing full. The moon associated not only with the eye of Horus in its healing and regenerative powers, but also with the birth of Thoth. In some tellings of that myth, it is said that Thoth is birthed from Set's forehead as a result of the tricked insemination of of Set by Horus. So another divine or virgin creation or birth with the birth of Thoth. But we're going to get to Thoth in our next decoding of ancient Egypt. So as we come to the end of this part of the story, you can now see with clearer vision, even 4,000 or more years ago into the past, and know that the contendings of Horus and Set were really all about who was going to be ancient Egypt's god of the calendar, or the ruler, or god of every new year. Thank you for being here to once again take in more of this mind-blowing information. We'll end things here for now and pick it back up in our next decoding of Ancient Egypt piece. And until then, be well.